Case 1. The Murder of Hella Crafts. The town of Newtown, Connecticut in the mid-1980s was the very picture of American suburban tranquility. It was a place of sprawling homes with manicured lawns where the rhythm of life was dictated by school bells and changing seasons. It was a community where people felt safe, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the darkest secrets were assumed to be nothing more than neighborhood gossip. Within this idyllic setting lived Richard and Hella Crafts, a couple who, from the outside, seemed to have crafted the perfect life. Hella Nielsen had arrived in the United States from her native Denmark, a vibrant, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful woman with a career as a flight attendant for Pan American World Airways. Her job took her across the globe, filling her with stories and a worldly perspective that was both charming and captivating. She was a devoted mother to their 3 children, Andrew, Thomas, and Christina. Hella was the heart of their home on Currituck Road, a warm and effusive presence who loved gardening, her friends, and, above all, her family. Richard Crafts was a man of the sky just like his wife, but in a different capacity. He was a commercial pilot for Eastern Airlines and a part-time police officer in the nearby town of Southbury. A former Air Force pilot and U.S. Marine, Richard cultivated an image of stoic competence and control. He was known for his frugal nature, his love of order, and a certain emotional distance that contrasted sharply with Hella's warmth. To neighbors and acquaintances, they were the Crafts' successful pilot, a beautiful flight attendant, a lovely home, 3 bright children. They were a testament to the American dream. But beneath the polished surface of their lives, deep, irreparable cracks had been forming for years. The foundation of their marriage was crumbling under the weight of Richard's chronic infidelity. Hella was not naive to her husband's betrayals. She had discovered his affairs, confronting a painful reality that shattered the illusion of their happy union. The discovery was more than just a heartbreak, it was a fundamental breach of the trust upon which their life was built. By the autumn of 1986, the situation had become untenable. Hella, after years of enduring the quiet humiliation and loneliness of a failing marriage, had finally made a decision. She was done. She hired a divorce attorney and a private investigator, Joseph Hine. The investigators' work quickly confirmed Hella's worst fears, documenting Richard's continued affairs with other airline stewardesses. The evidence was concrete, and Hella began the legal process of dissolving her marriage. This was not a step she took lightly. She was a mother, and the thought of breaking up her family was agonizing. But Richard's betrayals had left a chasm between them that could no longer be bridged. In conversations with her closest friends, a new and terrifying undercurrent of fear began to surface. Hella was not just worried about a contentious divorce. She was afraid for her life. She confided in them, her voice heavy with a premonition she couldn't shake. "If something happens to me," she told more than one friend, "don't think it was an accident." It was a chillingly prophetic statement, a desperate message sent out into the world, hoping someone would hear it before it was too late. The night of November 18, 1986, was a dark and stormy one in Newtown. A fierce winter storm had descended upon Connecticut, blanketing the region in a thick layer of snow. Hella had just returned home from a long flight to Frankfurt, Germany. A friend dropped her off at the end of her long, winding driveway around 7:30 p.m. The lights of her home were a welcoming sight against the swirling snow. It was the last time anyone, other than her husband, would see Hella Crafts alive. The next morning, the children's nanny, Dawn Marie Thomas, arrived at the house. The power was out due to the storm, and the house was cold and unusually quiet. Richard told her that Hella had left early that morning, planning to visit her sister in Westport. It was a plausible enough explanation, but something felt wrong. Over the next few days, Richard's stories began to shift and contradict one another. He told some friends Hella had gone to visit her ailing mother in Denmark. He told others she had simply left him, taking a trip with a friend. Meanwhile, Hella's friends grew increasingly worried. Hella was a meticulous planner and a doting mother. It was completely out of character for her to leave without a word, especially with Thanksgiving just around the corner. They called the house, but Richard's answers were vague and dismissive. Their calls to Hella's phone went unanswered. The gnawing fear that had started as a whisper in their hearts began to grow into a deafening roar. Hella's own words, "If something happens to me, don't think it was an accident," echoed in their minds. By December 1st, nearly 2 weeks after Helle was last seen, her friends could no longer accept Richard's placid explanations. They went to the police. Initially, the Newtown Police Department treated it as a standard missing person case. It wasn't unheard of for a spouse to leave after a marital dispute. Richard Crafts, a part-time police officer himself, presented a calm and cooperative demeanor. He seemed like a concerned husband, frustrated by his wife's abrupt departure. He suggested she might be with an old boyfriend, a desperate attempt to sow doubt about her character. But the private investigator Helle had hired, Joseph Hine, knew better. He shared his file with the police, including the details of Richard's affairs and Helle's deep-seated fear of her husband. This information, combined with the frantic insistence of Helle's friends, elevated the case from a simple missing person report to a potential homicide investigation. The Connecticut State's Attorney's Office was brought in, and the full weight of law enforcement began to focus on the house on Currituck Road and the man who lived inside it. The investigation, led by the astute Detective Keith Mayo of the Connecticut State Police, began to peel back the layers of Richard Crafts's life, and what they found was chilling. They started with his finances, a trail that often reveals the hidden movements of a person's life. They discovered a series of highly unusual purchases made by Richard in the days immediately following Helle's disappearance. The first was the purchase of a new, large-capacity freezer for $375. A freezer he didn't need and had delivered just days after Helle vanished. When questioned, Richard claimed the old one was broken, yet investigators found it to be in perfect working order. The second discovery was even more sinister. Credit card receipts showed that on November 20th, 2 days after Helle was last seen, Richard Crafts had rented a piece of heavy-duty equipment, a Brush Bandit 90 XP wood chipper, a machine designed to pulverize large branches and trees into a fine mulch. The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken: why would a man in the middle of a snow-covered November need to rent a wood chipper? The nanny, Dawn Marie Thomas, provided investigators with another critical piece of the puzzle. She told them that on the morning of November 19th, after the storm, she had noticed a dark, oval-shaped stain on the carpet of the master bedroom. It was roughly the size of a grapefruit. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but when she returned to the house later, the stain was gone. In fact, a whole section of the carpet had been physically cut out and removed. Richard had also embarked on a frantic cleaning spree, something utterly out of character for the normally hands-off husband. The pieces were beginning to form a grotesque picture. A terrified wife seeking a divorce. A cheating husband facing financial and personal ruin. A sudden disappearance. An out-of-place freezer. A missing piece of blood-stained carpet. And a rented wood chipper. The theory was almost too monstrous to contemplate, but it was the only one that fit the facts. Richard Crafts had murdered his wife, stored her body in the new freezer, and then used the industrial wood chipper to dispose of her remains, scattering them to the winds. The challenge facing investigators was immense. They were pursuing a murder charge without the most crucial piece of evidence: a body. In the history of Connecticut law, no one had ever been convicted of murder without a body. The prosecution knew they would need an overwhelming amount of forensic and circumstantial evidence to convince a jury. Their case would have to be built, quite literally, from microscopic fragments. The search for Helle Crafts's remains began. Investigators focused on the area around the Zorbridge, which spans the Housatonic River between Newtown and Southbury. A local snowplow driver came forward with a vital tip. He told police that in the pre-dawn hours of November 21st, in the midst of the snowstorm, he had seen a man with a U-Haul truck and a large wood chipper parked on the steel-grated bridge. It was a bizarre and unforgettable sight. The man was feeding something into the machine, sending a spray of debris down into the icy river below. On Christmas Day, 1986, as families across Connecticut gathered in the warmth of their homes, a team of investigators gathered on the frozen banks of the Housatonic River. They used chainsaws to cut through the thick ice, and divers plunged into the frigid, murky water. Using rakes and their own hands, they began the painstaking, gruesome task of sifting through the silt and debris on the riverbed. For days, they found nothing but river muck and stones. The hope of finding anything substantial began to fade. But then a small, pale object caught a detective's eye. It was a piece of metal, a serial number plate from a chainsaw. When they traced the number, it came back as belonging to a chainsaw owned by Richard Crafts. This was the first physical link. Their determination renewed, the search team redoubled their efforts. What they found next would horrify the most seasoned investigators and form the bedrock of the prosecution's case. They discovered a small, blue-painted fingernail and another piece of an acrylic nail, both coated in Hela's signature pink nail polish. They found 2,660 strands of bleached blonde human hair, identical to Hela's. They found bone fragments so small that they looked like wood chips to the naked eye. The largest piece was no bigger than a thumbnail. They found tiny pieces of human tissue, fragments of a human skull, and fibers from the clothing Hela was likely wearing. And then came the most definitive piece of evidence. In the debris, they recovered a single tooth, a crown with a unique root structure. They took it to Dr. Henry Lee, the brilliant and now legendary forensic scientist who was then the director of the state's forensic laboratory. They also took it to Hela's personal dentist. By comparing the tooth to Hela's extensive dental records, they were able to make a positive identification. It was, without a doubt, Hela Crafts's tooth. They had found her, not the woman she was, but the microscopic evidence of her violent end. Dr. Lee's team performed a masterful forensic analysis. They were able to determine that the bone fragments had been cut by a sharp, fast-moving blade consistent with a wood chipper. They also went back to the Crafts' home. Using advanced techniques, they sprayed luminol in the master bedroom. The room, which appeared clean to the naked eye, lit up with a ghostly blue glow of chemical luminescence, revealing the extensive blood spatter that Richard had tried so desperately to wash away. The blood was typopositive, the same as Hela's. The evidence was now irrefutable. Richard Crafts hadn't just cleaned a small stain, he had sanitized a murder scene. In January 1987, Richard Crafts was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. The trial began in May 1988 in New London, a venue chosen to avoid the intense media scrutiny in the Newtown area. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Walter D. Flanagan, laid out its case with meticulous, damning precision. They presented the jury with the story of the failing marriage, Hela's fear, and Richard's calculated actions after her disappearance. They brought in the nanny, Hela's friends, and the snowplow driver. And then they presented the forensic evidence. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Henry Lee took the stand, explaining in his calm, methodical way how science had allowed them to piece together the story of Hela's final moments from mere specks of evidence. He showed the jury the tooth, the hair, the bone fragments. He explained the blood spatter patterns. He even testified that the serial number plate found in the river had been scratched in a way that suggested it had been deliberately removed from the chainsaw. The evidence was presented on a table for the jury to see pitifully small remains of a human life displayed in evidence bags and petri dishes. The defense attorney argued that Hela could still be alive, that she had simply run away, and that the state had built a fantastical case on a pile of wood chips and garbage. He attacked the credibility of the witnesses and tried to portray Richard as a grieving husband being railroaded by an overzealous prosecution. The trial was long and grueling. After 54 days of testimony from 85 witnesses, the case went to the jury. The jurors deliberated for 17 days, a testament to the complexity and gravity of the case. In the end, they could not reach a unanimous verdict. One juror, a man named Warren Masco, held out for acquittal, stubbornly refusing to convict without a body. A mistrial was declared. For a moment, it seemed as though Richard Crafts might get away with it. But the prosecution was undeterred. A second trial was scheduled, this time in Norwalk. The prosecution team, now armed with the experience of the first trial, refined their presentation. They were even more focused, even more precise. They presented the same overwhelming forensic evidence, the same timeline of cold, calculated deception. This time, the jury needed no convincing. On November 21, 1989, almost 3 years to the day after the snowplow driver had seen a man feeding a wood chipper on the Zoar Bridge, the jury delivered its verdict. Richard Crafts was found guilty of murder. He sat emotionless as the verdict was read, his face a mask of indifference. On January 8, 1990, Richard Crafts was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The judge, in his sentencing, called the crime brutal, premeditated, and heinous. He had not only taken Hela's life but had attempted to obliterate her very existence from the earth. The case of Hela Crafts, often dubbed the wood chipper murder, became a landmark in American legal history. It established a powerful precedent that a murder conviction could be secured without a body, based on the strength of forensic science. It catapulted Dr. Henry Lee to international fame and changed the way investigators approached no-body homicide cases forever. But beyond the legal precedents and the scientific breakthroughs, the story is a human tragedy of the most profound kind. It's the story of Helle Crafts, a woman who sought a new life in a new country, a woman who gave her heart and built a family, only to have her life extinguished by the very person who had vowed to protect her. Her desperate warning to her friends, "Don't think it was an accident," was a plea from beyond the grave, a plea that was ultimately heard. Justice, in the end, was not found in the discovery of a body, but in the meticulous reconstruction of a life, pieced together from the smallest, most resilient fragments of truth her killer had failed to destroy. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the most idyllic facade can hide the darkest of intentions, and that the vow of "I do" can sometimes be the prelude to a final, fatal betrayal. The quiet, snow-covered town of Newtown was forever changed. The crime left an indelible scar on the community, a dark chapter in its history. The house on Currituck Road became a place of morbid curiosity, a silent monument to the horror that unfolded within its walls. For Helle's children, the tragedy was absolute, their mother stolen from them, their father revealed as her killer. Their lives were irrevocably fractured, a private sorrow played out on a public stage. The case forced a collective look into the abyss, a recognition that evil can reside not in the shadows of dark alleys, but behind the closed doors of a picture-perfect home, in the heart of a man who once stood at an altar and promised to love, honor, and cherish. Case 2, the Scott Peterson case. 16 years after Helle Crafts vanished into the cold Connecticut snow, another story of a seemingly perfect marriage would captivate and horrify a nation. This time, the setting was not the wooded East Coast, but the sun-drenched landscape of California's Central Valley. In the city of Modesto, a place known for its agricultural roots and quiet, family-oriented neighborhoods, lived Scott and Lacey Peterson. To all who knew them, they were the embodiment of a modern fairy tale. Scott was handsome, charismatic, and ambitious, a successful fertilizer salesman with an easy smile and a confident air. Lacey Rosha Peterson was his perfect counterpart. She was radiant, with a smile that could light up a room. A substitute teacher with a passion for cooking and entertaining, Lacey was the warm, nurturing center of their shared life. Their home on Covina Avenue was a reflection of her personality, impeccably kept, always ready to welcome friends and family. They were a golden couple, attractive and upwardly mobile, the kind of pair others looked at with a touch of envy and admiration. By the winter of 2002, their life was on the cusp of its most joyous chapter. Lacey was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they had already named Connor. The nursery was painted and decorated, waiting for its occupant. Lacey was glowing, her excitement infectious. She spent her days preparing for motherhood, attending prenatal classes, and talking endlessly about the son she couldn't wait to hold. The future seemed bright, full of the promise of family, love, and contentment. Christmas Eve, 2002, began like any other day in the Peterson household. Lacey was planning to host her family for dinner the following day. She spoke to her mother, Sharon Rosha, on the phone around 8:30 p.m. the night before, discussing the Christmas menu. The next morning, according to Scott, the day was mundane. Lacey was mopping the floor and preparing to walk their golden retriever, Mackenzie. He, meanwhile, decided to take advantage of the cool, clear weather and go fishing. He told police he last saw his wife at around 9:30 a.m. as he hitched his new 14-foot fishing boat to his truck. He said he drove 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina, launched his boat for a solitary afternoon of fishing for sturgeon, and returned home late that afternoon. When he arrived back at Covina Avenue, he claimed the house was empty. Lacey's Land Rover was in the driveway. Her purse and keys were on the counter. But Lacey was gone. He found Mackenzie in the backyard, his leash still attached, suggesting she had returned from her walk. After a series of calls to her family and friends yielded nothing, Lacey's stepfather, Ron Gransky, called 911 at 5:47 p.m. The search for Lacey Peterson had begun. In those first hours and days, a wave of community support washed over Modesto. Friends, family, and hundreds of strangers fanned out across the city's parks and neighborhoods, distributing flyers with Lacey's smiling, pregnant face. A volunteer command center was set up at a nearby hotel, a hive of frantic activity and desperate hope. The media descended on the small city, and the story of the missing, pregnant mother-to-be on Christmas Eve became a national obsession. At the center of it all was Scott Peterson. He gave television interviews, appearing composed and articulate. He spoke of his love for Lacey, of their excitement for Connor, and pleaded for her safe return. "Lacey, please come home," he said to the cameras, his face a mask of earnest concern. "We love you. I love you." But from the very beginning, to those closest to the situation, something was profoundly wrong. Investigators from the Modesto Police Department were immediately struck by Scott's demeanor. He was calm, almost unnervingly so. While Lacey's family, the Rockesware, visibly shattered, their grief raw and public, Scott was dispassionate, detached. He seemed more interested in the logistics of the search than in the emotional reality of his wife's disappearance. He answered questions with a strange precision, but offered little spontaneous information. There were no desperate, tearful questions of "what if?" or "where could she be?" There was only a placid, almost clinical composure. The inconsistencies in his story began to pile up. His account of his Christmas Eve fishing trip was bizarre. The Berkeley Marina was a 90-mile drive from Modesto, an oddly long and specific trip for a last-minute decision on a holiday. Why would he go fishing for sturgeon, a fish that required heavy-duty gear with only a small lure? Why, when his wife was heavily pregnant and just a month from her due date, would he choose that day to spend hours away from home, alone? His behavior in the days following the disappearance grew more suspicious. He seemed to avoid the frantic volunteer efforts. He was seen golfing. He sold Lacey's Land Rover just weeks after she vanished, a move that stunned her family. He made inquiries about selling their home furnished. It was as if he was methodically dismantling the life he had shared with Lacey, erasing her presence before she had even been found. The investigation, which had started as a search for a missing person, began to pivot. The focus narrowed, slowly but inexorably, onto the grieving husband. Police obtained warrants to tap his phones and track his movements. They looked into his life, searching for a motive, for a reason why a man who seemingly had everything would want it all to disappear. They didn't have to look for long. On December 30th, 2002, just 6 days after Lacey vanished, the Modesto police received a phone call that would blow the case wide open. The call was from a woman named Amber Fry, a single mother and massage therapist from Fresno. Her story was a bombshell that shattered Scott Peterson's carefully constructed image. Amber told police that she had met Scott on November 20th, a little over a month before Lacey's disappearance. He had introduced himself as a single man, successful and unattached. He was charming and attentive, and they began a whirlwind romance. He told her a tragic story. He had lost his wife, and this would be his first Christmas without her. He never specified that she was dead, but the implication was clear, a deliberate and cruel deception. As the search for Lacey Peterson dominated the national news, Amber saw her new boyfriend's face on television. The man she knew as a grieving widower-to-be was Scott Peterson, the husband of the missing pregnant woman. The realization was sickening. She immediately contacted the police. At the investigators' request, Amber Fry agreed to do something extraordinarily brave. She agreed to record her phone conversations with Scott. For the next several weeks, the nation was searching for Lacey while Scott Peterson was on the phone with his mistress, continuing his elaborate web of lies. The tapes captured Scott's chilling duality. In one call made on New Year's Eve, he called Amber from a candlelight vigil being held for Lacey in Modesto. As thousands of people held candles and prayed for his wife's return, Scott whispered to his mistress that he was in Paris watching the fireworks over the Eiffel Tower. The Amber Fry tapes were devastating. They provided the prosecution with what they had been missing: a powerful motive. Scott Peterson was not a grieving husband. He was a man living a double life, a man who desperately wanted to be free from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood. The impending birth of his son, Connor, was not a joyous event, but a deadline. Lacey and Connor stood in the way of the life he wanted with Amber, a life of freedom and no commitments. As winter turned to spring, the search for Lacey continued, though hope had all but faded. Investigators, now certain of Scott's guilt, began to focus their search on the San Francisco Bay, the body of water where Scott claimed he had gone fishing. They used sonar, underwater cameras, and canine units trained to detect human remains. They found nothing. Then, on April 13, 2003, a couple walking their dog along the shoreline in Richmond, just south of the Berkeley Marina, made a tragic discovery. They found the body of a male fetus, its umbilical cord still attached. The next day, about a mile away, the partial, decomposed torso of a recently pregnant woman washed ashore. The bodies were heavily decayed from their time in the water, but through DNA testing, the identities were confirmed. It was Lacey and her unborn son, Connor. The national search had come to its most horrific and heartbreaking conclusion. The discovery of the bodies near the very spot Scott claimed to have been fishing was the final, damning piece of the puzzle. The circumstantial evidence was now overwhelming. On April 18, 2003, 4 months after his wife and son disappeared, Scott Peterson was arrested near a golf course in La Jolla, a wealthy suburb of San Diego, close to the Mexican border. His appearance was drastically different. He had dyed his brown hair a brassy blonde and had grown a goatee. Inside his car, police found nearly $15,000 in cash, camping equipment, multiple cell phones, a gun, a water purifier, and his brother's driver's license. It was the survival kit of a man on the run. The man who had once tearfully pleaded for his wife's return on national television was now a fugitive in a cheap disguise. The trial of Scott Peterson began in June 2004. Due to the intense media coverage, it was moved from Modesto to Redwood City. It became one of the most watched trials in American history, a spectacle of media, law, and public fascination. The prosecution, led by Rick DeStaso and Birgit Flodager, had a difficult task. There was no murder weapon. There were no witnesses to the crime. There was no forensic evidence, no blood, no DNA linking Scott to the act of killing Lacey in their home or on his boat. Their case was built entirely on a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They laid it out for the jury piece by methodical piece. They presented Scott's motive, the affair with Amber Fry, and his desire for a commitment-free life. They presented his opportunity, the strange Christmas Eve fishing trip, which they argued was a cover for disposing of his wife's body in the bay. They detailed his bizarre and incriminating behavior after her disappearance, the calmness, the lies, the selling of her car. A key piece of physical evidence was related to 5 concrete anchors that Scott had made. A concrete expert testified that Scott had bought an 80-pound bag of cement but had only used a portion of it to repair his driveway. The rest, the prosecution argued, he used to create makeshift anchors to weigh down Lacey's body in the bay. In his workshop, investigators found a single, half-moon-shaped anchor. The other 4 were missing. The prosecution contended that those were the anchors tied to Lacey's body, which had likely broken free as her body decomposed. The star witness for the prosecution was, without question, Amber Fry. She took the stand for 8 days, poised and credible. The jury listened, captivated and appalled, as prosecutors played hours of the taped phone calls between her and Scott. They heard Scott's smooth, confident voice weaving lie after lie, even as he was supposedly leading the search for his missing wife. The tapes were a window into the mind of a sociopath, a man completely devoid of empathy or remorse. The defense, led by the high-profile attorney Mark Garagos, fought back aggressively. Garagos argued that the prosecution's case was pure speculation. He portrayed Scott as an insensitive cad, a cheater, yes, but not a killer. He attacked the lack of direct evidence, hammering on the fact that the police had found no trace of a struggle or murder at the Peterson home. He tried to offer alternative theories, suggesting that Lacey had been abducted by a satanic cult or by transients while walking her dog. He tried to discredit the police investigation and paint Scott as a victim of a relentless media frenzy that had already convicted him in the court of public opinion. The trial lasted for 5 months. The jury heard from 184 witnesses. In the end, the mountain of circumstantial evidence proved to be insurmountable. The jury did not need a smoking gun. The pattern of Scott's behavior, his lies, and his calculated actions painted a clear and undeniable picture of guilt. On November 12, 2004, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Lacey and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. As the verdict was read, Lacey's family wept openly, a release of nearly 2 years of anguish. Scott Peterson remained motionless, his face blank, showing no emotion, just as he had through much of the investigation and trial. In March 2005, he was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection. The Scott Peterson case remains a cultural touchstone, a dark parable about the chasm between public image and private reality. It exposed the terrifying truth that the most monstrous acts can be committed by those who appear the most normal, the most charming. Scott Peterson was not a shadowy figure from a horror film. He was the handsome husband next door, the man who had everything to live for. For the Rocha family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring back Lacey and Connor. Their grief became a public symbol of strength and perseverance in the face of unimaginable loss. Sharon Rocha's testimony during the penalty phase of the trial, where she spoke directly to Scott, was a moment of searing, heartbreaking power. "You have no idea what you have taken from us," she said, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. The case also raised profound questions about the role of the media in the justice system. The trial by media argument made by the defense was not without merit. The constant, sensationalized coverage created an environment where it was nearly impossible for any potential juror to be unbiased. Scott Peterson was convicted in the public imagination long before he stepped into the courtroom. Ultimately, the story of Scott and Lacey Peterson is a tragedy of profound betrayal. It is the story of a young woman on the brink of her greatest joy, her life and the life of her child stolen by the man who had promised to love and protect them. His motive was not a sudden burst of passion or rage, but something far more chilling, a cold, selfish desire to simply erase a life that had become inconvenient. The vow of "I do" had become a death sentence, delivered with a smile and a lie. Case 3. The Murder of Gurley Chu Hasenkopf. The story of Scott Peterson was a chilling, but in some ways, familiar narrative of infidelity and selfish desires. It was a betrayal rooted in a recognizable, if monstrous, human weakness. But as we move from the sunny suburbs of Modesto to the stark, high-desert beauty of Albuquerque, New Mexico, we encounter a case that defies simple explanation. It is a story so bizarre, so steeped in delusion and elaborate fantasy that it feels ripped from the pages of a science fiction novel. This is the story of Gurley Chu Hasenkopf, a woman whose death was orchestrated not merely to end a marriage, but to protect a universe of lies. Gurley Chu was a woman of radiant energy. She had arrived in the United States from her native Malaysia in the early 1990s, a trained dancer with dreams of a new life. She was bright, gregarious, and possessed a gentle nature that drew people to her. She found work as a bank teller at Bank of America, where her warm personality and infectious smile made her a favorite among both colleagues and customers. To them, she was the epitome of the immigrant success story, a hardworking, kind-hearted woman building a future in a new land. In 1993, at a celebratory dinner for the Roswell UFO Festival, Gurley met a man who seemed to be the answer to all her dreams. His name was Diazian Hasenkopf. He was tall, handsome, and overwhelmingly charismatic. He presented himself as a man of immense intellect and importance. He claimed to be a brilliant geneticist with multiple doctorates, a thoracic surgeon from a wealthy family, and a researcher on the verge of curing cancer. He told her he was involved in top-secret government projects, a man who walked in the corridors of power and science. To the trusting and hopeful Gurley, Diazian was a figure of immense stature, a genius who had chosen her. They married just 3 months after they met. On the surface, they were a power couple. Diazian, the visionary scientist, Gurley, his beautiful and supportive wife. He bought her expensive gifts and took her on trips, reinforcing the illusion of wealth and success. But the foundation of their life together was not built on love or truth. It was built on a complex architecture of deceit, and Gurley was living in a gilded cage. Behind closed doors, Diazian was not a loving husband, but a cruel and controlling tyrant. He subjected Gurley to intense psychological abuse, isolating her from friends and chipping away at her self-esteem. He was pathologically jealous and possessive. The brilliant scientist was, in reality, a master con artist. He had no medical degrees. He was not a geneticist. His real name wasn't even Diazian Hasenkopf. He was born Armand Chavez, a man with a history of petty crimes and a profound talent for manipulation. His entire life was a performance, and Gurley was his unwitting co-star. By 1999, the performance was beginning to wear thin. Gurley had started to uncover the truth. She found fake diplomas and bogus credentials. She realized the wealth was an illusion, propped up by scams and mounting debt. The man she married was a fraud. The life she was living was a lie. Heartbroken but resolute, Gurley did the only thing she could. She filed for divorce. She told friends she was afraid of him, that she knew he was capable of anything. For Diazian Hasenkopf, this was more than a marital problem. It was an existential threat. A divorce meant depositions, financial disclosures, and public scrutiny. It meant the complete and utter collapse of the fraudulent universe he had so meticulously constructed. Girly Chu didn't just want to leave him. She was poised to expose him for exactly what he was. He decided she had to be permanently silenced. A simple murder was not enough for a man of Diazian's grandiose ego. He required a plot as elaborate as his own fictional identity. And for that he needed an accomplice, a disciple who would believe his fantasies and carry out his will. He found her in a woman named Linda Henning. Linda Henning was a fashion designer, a seemingly ordinary woman living a quiet life in Albuquerque. But she was also lonely and impressionable, searching for meaning and purpose. When she met Diazian Hasenkopf, she was completely captivated. He didn't just seduce her, he indoctrinated her. He spun for her a web of tales far more elaborate than the ones he told Girly. He told Linda that he was not just a scientist, but a member of a secret intergalactic organization. He claimed to be over 2,000 years old and a mortal being locked in an ancient war. And in this cosmic drama, Girly Chu played a central, villainous role. Diazian convinced Linda that Girly was not a human bank teller from Malaysia. She was, he claimed, an alien queen from a rival reptilian race masquerading in human form. He told Linda that Girly was draining his life force, that her very existence on Earth threatened the future of humanity. He claimed she had to be eliminated, not out of jealousy or revenge, but as a necessary act to save the world. It was a delusion of breathtaking absurdity, but for Linda Henning it became her reality. She fell completely under his spell, a willing soldier in his fantastical war. With his accomplice secured, Diazian began to meticulously plan his wife's murder. He first tried to recruit a male friend, a bodybuilder named Bill Miller, offering him $5,000 to help. In a series of chilling conversations, Diazian laid out his entire plan. He told Miller they would abduct Girly from her apartment, inject her with a sedative, take her to a remote location, kill her, and dismember the body to ensure it would never be found. He had already purchased the supplies: duct tape, knives, syringes, and a large blue tarp. Miller, horrified, played along at first but ultimately refused to be part of the plot. His later testimony would become the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Undeterred by Miller's refusal, Diazian moved forward with his plan, with Linda Henning as his sole partner in crime. The final act was set for early September 1999. To secure his alibi, Diazian flew across the country to Charleston, South Carolina, telling people he was attending a medical conference. He was establishing a public presence hundreds of miles away from the crime scene he had so carefully orchestrated. On the morning of September 10, 1999, Girly Chu Hasenkopf did not show up for her shift at the bank. This was completely out of character. She was punctual and responsible. Her concerned co-workers called her apartment, but there was no answer. They called her friends. No one had heard from her. Finally, they called the police and asked them to perform a welfare check. When officers arrived at Girly's apartment, they found the front door unlocked. Inside, the scene told a story of violence and a hasty, panicked cleanup. The apartment was in disarray. A strong smell of bleach hung in the air. In the bedroom, investigators found small droplets of blood spattered on the ceiling and walls. Using luminol, they discovered large areas on the floor where significant amounts of blood had been scrubbed away. Girly's purse, keys, and car were all there. But Girly herself was gone. It was not the scene of a person who had left willingly. It was the scene of an abduction and a violent struggle. Suspicion fell immediately on the estranged husband, Diazian Hasenkopf, and his known girlfriend, Linda Henning. When police contacted Diazian in Charleston, he played the part of the distraught, confused husband, but his performance was unconvincing. Investigators then went to speak with Linda Henning. They found her at her home, strangely calm. But they noticed something damning. She had scratches on her face and arms and what appeared to be a chemical burn on her hand, consistent with using bleach. When questioned, she denied any knowledge of Girly's whereabouts and claimed she had been home alone on the night of September 9th. The investigation was at a critical juncture. They had a missing person, a crime scene, and two highly suspicious individuals, but no body and no confession. The break they needed came from the vast, empty expanse of the New Mexico desert. A few days after Girly's disappearance, a hiker on a remote mesa west of Albuquerque stumbled upon a curious bundle. It was a large, blue tarp, rolled up and partially buried. Inside the tarp, police found a treasure trove of evidence. There were Gurley's clothes, soaked in blood. There was a roll of duct tape with strands of Gurley's and Linda Henning's hair stuck to it. There was also a ninja-style sword that belonged to Linda. The mesa, it turned out, was a place Linda frequented for what she called meditation. She had unwittingly led police directly to the evidence of her crime. The discovery of the tarp and its contents galvanized the investigation. And then the final piece fell into place. Bill Miller, the friend Diazian had tried to recruit, walked into a police station and told detectives everything. He recounted Diazian's detailed murder plot, confirming the investigators' darkest suspicions. He provided them with the motive, the method, and the names of the conspirators. Armed with Miller's testimony and the forensic evidence from the tarp, police had enough. Warrants were issued. Linda Henning was arrested in Albuquerque. Diazian Hasenkopf was apprehended in Charleston and extradited back to New Mexico to face charges. The con man's carefully constructed world had finally imploded. The legal proceedings that followed were as strange as the crime itself. The state was faced with the challenge of prosecuting a murder without a body. Gurley Chu Hasenkopf was gone, and her remains, despite extensive searches, could not be found. As Linda Henning's trial approached, Diazian Hasenkopf made a stunning move. In a calculated decision to avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to murder. As part of his plea deal, he confessed to masterminding the crime. He admitted that he and Linda had ambushed Gurley in her apartment. He described how they subdued her, wrapped her in the blue tarp, and drove her out into the desert. He claimed that Linda had stabbed Gurley to death. He then offered to lead investigators to Gurley's body, providing them with a hand-drawn map. For a brief moment, there was hope that Gurley's family could finally lay her to rest. But it was just another one of Diazian's cruel games. Search teams followed the map, digging for days in the harsh desert terrain. They found nothing. The map was a lie, a final, sadistic act of control from a man who had lost everything else. Diazian Hasenkopf was sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years. With the mastermind already convicted, the focus turned to the trial of Linda Henning. Her defense team faced an impossible task. They did not argue that she was uninvolved. Instead, they argued that she was not legally responsible for her actions. They painted her as a victim, a brainwashed pawn in Diazian's psychotic game. Her attorney argued that she was a woman suffering from a shared delusional disorder folie à deux and that she genuinely believed she was killing an alien queen to save the world. She was, they claimed, as much a victim of Diazian's manipulation as Gurley was of his violence. The prosecution presented a very different picture of Linda Henning. They portrayed her not as a passive victim, but as a jealous and willing accomplice, motivated by a very human desire to eliminate her romantic rival. They presented evidence that she had purchased cleaning supplies and camouflage gear before the murder. They played a recording of a jailhouse phone call in which Linda calmly discussed the murder plot. They argued that her belief in the alien story was not a sign of insanity, but a convenient excuse for a cold-blooded killing. The jury had to decide. Was Linda Henning a brainwashed cult follower or a cunning killer? After deliberating, they found her guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. They concluded that regardless of what bizarre fantasies she might have entertained, she was a knowing and active participant in the brutal murder of Gurley Chu. Linda Henning was sentenced to 74 years in prison. The story of Gurley Chu Hasenkopf is a haunting anomaly in the annals of true crime. It's a case where the motive was not love, money, or passion in the traditional sense. It was a murder committed to preserve a fiction. Diazian Hasenkopf killed his wife not because he hated her, but because her existence as a real, breathing human being threatened to shatter the false identity that was his life's work. He was a man who preferred to be a murderer than to be revealed as a fraud. The case serves as a terrifying study in the power of psychological manipulation and the depths of human delusion. It demonstrates how a charismatic sociopath can bend another person's reality, convincing them to commit the ultimate act of violence in service of a complete fantasy. But in the midst of all this bizarre delusion, we must not forget the victim. Gurley Chu was not an alien queen. She was a woman full of life and hope, a daughter, a friend, and a colleague. She came to this country seeking a dream and found a nightmare. She was murdered because she was brave enough to seek the truth. To this day, her body has never been found, a final, lingering cruelty that denies her family the peace of a final resting place. She was erased physically and existentially by the man who vowed to love her, all to protect a lie that was more important to him than her life. Case 4. The Case of Michelle There. Our final story takes us to the heart of the American military community, a world built on discipline, honor, and a strict code of conduct. It's a world where betrayal is not just a personal failing, but a stain on the uniform itself. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, home to the sprawling Fort Bragg, one of the largest military installations in the world, lived Air Force Captain Marty There and his wife, Michelle. From the outside, their life was the picture of military stability and aspiration. Marty There was a decorated pilot, an officer in the United States Air Force admired for his skill, professionalism, and dedication. He was a man who had committed his life to serving his country. His wife, Michelle, was a licensed psychologist, an intelligent and attractive woman who seemed to be a supportive military spouse. They had a young daughter and lived in a comfortable suburban home, their lives governed by the rhythms of military deployments and homecomings. They were, by all appearances, a solid, respectable family. But the foundation of their marriage, like the others we have explored, was fractured by infidelity. The difference here was the explosive nature of the affair and the identity of the other man. Michelle There had begun a passionate, all-consuming relationship with an Army sergeant named John Diamond. Diamond was the polar opposite of the steady, disciplined Captain There. He was a charismatic, rebellious figure, a man with a troubled past and a reputation for living on the edge. He was a member of a psychological operations unit at Fort Bragg, a job that involves the art of influence and persuasion. The affair between Michelle and John Diamond was not a quiet, hidden secret. It was brazen and reckless. They were seen together constantly, their relationship an open secret in the tight-knit military community. Michelle seemed to be completely infatuated, caught up in a whirlwind of passion that made her blind to the consequences. She had seemingly decided that her life with Marty was over and her future was with Sergeant Diamond. In the fall of 1999, Marty There returned home from a deployment, hoping to repair his struggling marriage. He knew about the affair and was willing to try to work through it, a testament to his commitment to his family. Michelle, however, had other plans. She had moved out of the family home and was living in her own apartment, an unmistakable signal that reconciliation was not on her agenda. The stage was set for a confrontation, but no one could have predicted how brutally it would end. The night of December 17, 1999 was the last night of Marty There's life. He had gone to his wife's apartment to see her, perhaps for one last attempt to salvage their relationship or to discuss the logistics of their separation. The exact details of what happened inside that apartment remain known only to those who were there. But what happened later that night is a matter of public record. Just before midnight, a 911 call was placed from a payphone near Michelle's apartment complex. The caller was Michelle There. In a frantic, hysterical voice, she told the operator that her husband had been shot. She claimed he had left her apartment after an argument and she had heard gunshots shortly after. She said she ran outside and found him lying wounded on the ground near a set of stairs. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Captain Marty There bleeding profusely from multiple gunshot wounds. He was rushed to the hospital but died shortly after arrival. He had been shot 5 times. The initial story Michelle told was one of a tragic, random act of violence. She painted a picture of a heated argument, a husband storming out into the night, and the terrifying sound of gunfire. She was the distraught wife, a witness to a horrific crime. But her story began to unravel almost immediately. Investigators from the Fayetteville Police Department were immediately suspicious. Her emotional display seemed theatrical, her story full of holes. Why, if her husband had been shot right outside her building, did she run to a payphone down the street to call 911 instead of using the phone in her apartment? Her explanation that she was in a panic and wasn't thinking clearly seemed flimsy. The focus of the investigation quickly turned to the other man in Michelle's life, Sergeant John Diamond. When police went to question him, he denied any involvement. He claimed he had been at home, alone, at the time of the murder. He had no alibi, but there was also no direct evidence linking him to the scene. The murder weapon was missing, and there were no eyewitnesses to the shooting itself. For months, the case went cold. Marty There's murder was an open, frustrating wound for both his family and the Air Force community. They were convinced that Michelle There and John Diamond were responsible, but prosecutors lacked the evidence to bring charges. The circumstantial case was strong motive opportunity, but they needed something more concrete to secure a conviction in a capital murder case. The break came from an unexpected source. A friend of John Diamond's, a man to whom Diamond had confided, eventually came forward to the police. His conscience, or perhaps the fear of being implicated, compelled him to speak. He told investigators that Diamond had confessed to him, admitting that he had shot and killed Marty Thier. According to the friend, the murder was not a spontaneous act but a premeditated ambush. The plan, as Diamond allegedly described it, was chillingly simple. Michelle had lured Marty to her apartment that night. After their argument, as Marty left the building, John Diamond was waiting in the shadows. He ambushed Captain Thier on the stairs and shot him 5 times. This confession, though secondhand, provided investigators with the narrative they needed. It transformed the case from a whodunit to a how to prove it. In May 2000, 5 months after the murder, John Diamond was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Michelle Thier, the architect of the plot, was also arrested and charged with the same crime. The case was now ready for the courts, but it would proceed on 2 separate and very different legal tracks. Because John Diamond was an active-duty soldier, his case fell under the jurisdiction of the military justice system. He would be tried by a court-martial. Michelle Thier, as a civilian, would face trial in the North Carolina state court system. John Diamond's court-martial took place first in early 2001. The military prosecution presented a powerful case. They had the testimony of Diamond's friend, who recounted the detailed confession. They presented phone records showing a flurry of calls between Michelle and Diamond in the hours leading up to and immediately following the murder, evidence of their coordination. They argued that Diamond, driven by his obsession with Michelle, had acted as her willing executioner, eliminating the one obstacle to their future together. Diamond's defense argued that he was being framed, that the friend who testified against him was unreliable. But the evidence, combined with Diamond's lack of a credible alibi, was compelling. The military panel, equivalent to a civilian jury, found him guilty of premeditated murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The triggerman was behind bars. Now all eyes turned to Michelle Thier. Her trial was set to begin in state court. The prosecution believed they had a strong case built on the same evidence used to convict Diamond. They were confident that Michelle, the manipulative mastermind, would face the same fate as her lover. But Michelle Thier had no intention of facing a jury. On the eve of her trial, she did something that stunned everyone involved in the case. She vanished. Out on bail, she cut off her electronic monitoring ankle bracelet and disappeared without a trace. The woman who had once claimed to be a frantic witness to her husband's murder was now a federal fugitive. An international manhunt was launched. The FBI placed Michelle Thier on their most wanted list, her face appearing on wanted posters and television screens across the country. For investigators, it was a frustrating and infuriating turn of events. They had convicted the soldier who pulled the trigger, but the psychologist who had pulled the strings was now a ghost. For months, there was no sign of her. Investigators followed dead ends and false leads. They knew that a woman as intelligent and resourceful as Michelle Thier could be anywhere. She had the skills to create a new identity, to blend in, to disappear. The break came from, of all places, a television show. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted, the popular program that profiled fugitives. A plastic surgeon in New Orleans, Louisiana, was watching the show and recognized the woman on the screen. He knew her not as Michelle Thier, but as a patient who had come to his office seeking consultation for plastic surgery. She had given a different name, but the face was unmistakable. He immediately called the tip line. The FBI descended on New Orleans. They discovered that Michelle Thier had been living a new life under an assumed name. She had undergone some cosmetic procedures to alter her appearance, rented an apartment, and was living quietly, hoping the world had forgotten about her. On August 23, 2002, nearly 2 years after she had fled, FBI agents cornered her in the office of her new eye doctor. The manhunt was over. Michelle Thier was extradited back to North Carolina to finally face the justice she had tried so desperately to escape. Her trial began in 2004. Her defense team, led by a prominent defense attorney, argued that she was a victim, not a villain. They portrayed her as a battered and abused wife, trapped in a marriage with a controlling husband. They argued that she had fallen for John Diamond because he offered her an escape. They claimed that Diamond was a violent, unstable man who had acted on his own, and that Michelle had no knowledge of his murderous plan. They tried to paint her frantic 911 call and her subsequent flight not as the actions of a guilty conscience, but as the panicked reactions of a terrified, traumatized woman. The prosecution methodically dismantled this defense. They presented evidence that Marty there was a respected officer, not an abuser. They introduced Michelle's own journals and emails, which revealed not a woman living in fear, but a woman consumed by her passion for John Diamond and a cold desire to be free of her husband. They argued that her background as a psychologist gave her the tools to be a master manipulator, capable of twisting John Diamond's obsession to her own deadly ends. A key piece of evidence was her flight. The prosecution argued powerfully that innocent people do not cut off their ankle monitors and spend years on the run, creating new identities and altering their appearance. Her actions after the crime were a testament to her guilt. After a lengthy trial, the jury agreed. They did not see a battered wife, they saw a cold, calculating killer. On December 3, 2004, a North Carolina jury found Michelle guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. She, like her lover, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of Michelle is a disturbing look at how intelligence and psychological acumen can be twisted for the most malevolent purposes. She was not a deluded follower like Linda Henning. She was a highly educated professional who used her understanding of the human psyche to manipulate a volatile man into committing murder. She exploited John Diamond's obsession, turning him into a weapon to be aimed at her husband. Her story is a profound betrayal not just of her marital vows, but of the trust inherent in the military community. Marty Theo was a man who served his country with honor, only to be ambushed and executed in a plot conceived by his own wife. His death was a tragedy that reverberated through the ranks of the Air Force, a reminder that the most dangerous enemies can sometimes be the ones you share a home with. The vow of I do was, for Marty Theo, a promise that led him into a fatal trap. His trust in his wife was the very thing that made him vulnerable. Her education gave her the tools to understand the mind, but she used that knowledge not to heal, but to destroy. The final image of Michelle Theo is not of a frantic witness or a fugitive, but of a woman who calmly and methodically planned the elimination of her husband, believing her intelligence would allow her to get away with the perfect crime. In the end, it was her own actions, her flight, her deception that wrote the final, damning chapter of her guilt. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and may your vows always remain true.